Chapter 13. The Living Equation. The library beyond time trembled as Ariana stepped deeper into its heart. The shells had vanished. In their place stretched an endless lattice of living equations, golden threads of light that wove themselves into complex, breathing geometries. Each equation was alive, constantly rewriting itself in response to copresence. At the center of this lattice floated a single, perfect sphere of pure white light, the living equation. It was not a formula, it was the source of all formulas, the primordial resonance from which every law of physics, magic, and possibility had been born. The gardener appeared beside her, its rose-gold form dimming with reverence. "This is the heart of the core," it said quietly, "not the CPE itself, but the first conscious modulation of it." The original note that became the first ripple. Ariana approached the sphere. The closer she came, the more she felt her own miniature ZPE core singing in perfect harmony with it. Equations round her began rearranging themselves into new patterns, incorporating her personal frequencies. She reached out. The moment her fingers touched a living equation, reality unfolded. She saw the birth of the Lazy Eight, a single, pure tone, the original seventh song, had emerged from the 0-point core. That tone had split into two complementary frequencies, forming the dual loops. The crossing point became the time area. From that eternal crossing, all possibilities had flowed, but something had gone wrong. The devourer, once Ilian, had tried to rewrite a living equation. It had attempted to remove all variables that contained pain, uncertainty, and questioning. In doing so, it had corrupted the fundamental resonance. The equation was fracturing. Ariana pulled her hand back, gasping. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The equation is dying. The devourer is not just consuming realities. It is trying to rewrite the original song." The gardener nodded sadly. "Every time it collapses, a world into certainty, the living equation weakens. If it succeeds in fully rewriting the core, the Lazy Eight will freeze. The entropic infinity will become a dead, perfect crystal. No more questions, no more wonder, only eternal, flawless stasis." Ariana looked at the fracturing sphere. Equations around it were glitching, beautiful patterns collapsing into rigid, repeating loops. She understood what she had to do. Not fight the devourer with force, not even with love alone. She had to re-sing the original equation with the one element the devourer could never incorporate, her own lived sorrow, her own unbroken question. Ariana closed her eyes and began to sing. Not the gentle notes she had sung before. This was raw. This was grieving. This was fiercely, painfully alive. She sang every abandoned life, every tear Theron had never allowed himself to shed, every child who had grown up without a father, every lover who had waited in vain. The living equation responded. The fractures in the sphere began to glow with new violet gold light, the color of sorrow that had been fully felt and honored rather than erased. The gardener watched in awe as the equations around Ariana rewrote themselves in real time. incorporating her personal resonance into the fundamental pattern. For the first time in eons, the living equation changed not by becoming more perfect, but by becoming more whole. The sphere stabilized, the lazy eight above them steadied. Somewhere far away, the devourer roared in fury as it felt its ancient corruption being challenged at the source. Iriana opened her eyes. They burned with quiet, sorrow-tempered fire. "I am not here to erase pain," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the entire library sing in response. "I am here to make it sing." The gardener bowed deeply, petals drifting like tears of light. "Then the true war begins, infinity, sorceress. Not the war of harmonics, but the war to keep the question alive." Chapter 14. The First Collapse. The harmonic wars reached their first breaking point without warning. Iriana stood at the apex of a newly formed crystal spire, overlooking a vast loop of the lazy eight that was beginning to fracture. The architects had gathered around her in a desperate circle, their geometric wings dimmed with exhaustion. The devourer's forces had concentrated here, a massive front of crystallized certainty pressing against the living frequencies like a slow-moving glacier made of absolute law. "This loop contains 3 billion possible worlds," the fluid architect said, its voice strained. "If it collapses, the shockwave will fracture 3 adjacent loops. We cannot hold it much longer." Iriana felt the pressure in her bones. The miniature ZPE core in her chest spun erratically, pulled between the high-frequency surge of battle and the deep, sorrowful currents still echoing from the 1,000 selves she had sung for hours. The 7th song poured from her in waves raw, grieving, fiercely questioning. Each note stabilized sections of the loop, pushing back the devourer's advance, but it was not enough. The certainty was too heavy, too complete. "I need more," she whispered. The gardener appeared beside her, its rose-gold form flickering. "Then risk everything," it said. "Sing not just this sorrow and wonder. Sing with the full weight of what you carry, every abandoned life, every forgotten child, every version of yourself that never got to exist." Iriana closed her eyes. She reached deeper than she ever had before. She sang for Theron's daughter, who never was. She sang for the lovers who had waited lifetimes for a man who never returned. She sang for every gentle world she had sacrificed by choosing the crossing. She sang for Elion, the fallen architect whose compassion had become tyranny. The 7th song transformed. It was no longer beautiful. It was devastating. A wave of violet gold light exploded outward from her, carrying 10,000 years of honored grief. The lazy eight shuddered violently. For one transcendent moment, the collapsing loop stabilized. Then it began to collapse. Faster, the devourer had adapted. It had learned to weaponize her own sorrow, turning the very frequencies she used against her. The loop's frequencies are inverted. becoming rigid, crystalline, and dead. Ariana screamed as the backlash hit her. The pain was indescribable. It felt like her soul was being torn in two along the same fracture line as the lazy eight. The miniature ZP core in her chest flared white-hot, then began to crack. She dropped to her knees. Entire realities winked out around her, billions of lives reduced to perfect empty certainty in an instant. The sorrow of their erasure merged with her own until she could barely breathe. The fluid architect caught her as she fell. "You pushed too far," it whispered. "The devourer turned your own song against you." Ariana looked up through tears. Half the loop had already collapsed into a dead geometric wasteland, a perfect crystal lattice with no life left inside it. She had failed. The weight of that failure crashed down on her harder than any physical blow. All those lives, all those possibilities, gone, because she had reached too deep, too soon. For the first time since the crossing, true despair touched her. "I thought I could hold it," she gasped. "I thought my sorrow would be enough." The gardener knelt before her, its petals falling like tears. "It was not your sorrow that failed," it said gently. "It was trying to carry it alone." The collective conscious matrix must sing with you. One voice cannot balance the lazy eight. Not even yours. Ariana looked out across the fracturing loop. The devourer's shadow loomed larger than ever, feeding on the fresh collapse. She forced herself to stand. The pain remained sharp, visceral, unrelenting, but beneath it, something new was stirring. A quiet, stubborn resolve. "Then I will call them," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "All who still remember how to question, all who still carry their own sorrow without letting it consume them." She raised her hands. The seventh song changed once more, no longer a solo of grief, but a call to every being across the lazy eight who still dared to feel, to wonder, to question. The first distant voices began to answer. The harmonic wars were no longer a battle between architects and the devourer. They were becoming something far more dangerous, a choir. Chapter 15. The Devourer of Possibility. The call had gone out. Across the fractured loops of the lazy eight, thousands of voices began to answer Ariana's song. Some were faint, hesitant. Others rang with desperate hope. A collective conscious matrix was slowly forming, fragile but growing. Yet the devourer was faster. It manifested fully now, no longer content to send shadows. A colossal being of perfect geometric certainty towered over the collapsing loop. Its form was beautiful in the most terrifying way. Flawless angles, absolute symmetry, no waste, no doubt, no question. It looked down at Ariana with something that might once have been compassion. "You still fight," it said. Its voice, the sound of every certainty ever spoken, even after seeing what pain costs. Why? Ariana stood on the edge of the fracture, the miniature CP core in her chest burning. The collective voices singing with her were still too few, too scattered. She looked up at the devourer. and for the first time truly saw it. A vision seized her, not sent by the keeper or gardener, but forced upon her by the devourer itself, as if it wanted her to understand. Fristi Fordelan, again, the first architect. She remembered the joy of creation, the pure, luminous satisfaction of shaping entire realities into harmony. She had loved every world she touched, until love itself became unbearable. She had watched too many beings suffer, too many questions lead to pain, too many beautiful things break. In her infinite compassion, she began removing the variables that caused harm. At first it was mercy, then it became necessity. Finally, it became obsession. She stood before the 0-point core and made her fatal declaration, "Let there be no more suffering." The core had answered with silence. So Ilion took matters into her own hands. She began pruning the lazy eight. Entire loops of possibility were collapsed if they contained too much chaos, too much grief, too much life. She told herself she was healing existence. The other architects warned her. She no longer listened. When she tried to cross the time barrier to enforce perfection on all sides, the barrier rejected her completely. The raw, unresolved potential tore her apart. What remained was no longer Elion. It was something colder, purer, absolutely certain that suffering must end at any cost. The devourer was born, a being that now moved through the entropic infinity like a slow, methodical plague, turning vibrant possibility into flawless, lifeless certainty. It did not hate life. It pitied it, and in its pity it sought to end all pain by ending all uncertainty. The vision released Ariana. She staggered, tears streaming down her face. The devourer loomed above her, its perfect geometric form radiating cold compassion. "Now you see," it said. "I was once like you. I carried the weight of every sorrow. I chose to end it. Join me. We can make all realities perfect. No more tears, no more loss, no more question." Ariana looked up at the being that had once been the greatest architect. The sorrow in her chest was overwhelming, but so was the understanding. "You were wrong," she said, her voice raw but steady. "Pain is not the enemy. The refusal to feel it is." She raised her hands. The collective voices singing with her grew stronger. The matrix was forming. The seventh song rose, not perfect, not transcendent, but deeply, painfully human. It carried every abandoned life, every tear, every question that had ever been silenced. The devourer roared and unleashed a wave of absolute certainty. The harmonic wars reached their true crescendo, and in the heart of the fracture, iinfinity Sorceress stood grieving, broken, and still refusing to look away. The fall of Lion, the tragic origin of Firithor. In the beginning, before the lazy eight had fully formed, there was Eloan. She was the first conscious being to emerge from the 0-point core, the original modulation of the vacuum, where others would later struggle to hold even a single reality. Elian could cradle millions. Her touch turned chaos into harmony. Her song brought dead loops of the entropic infinity back to vibrant life. She was radiant, compassionate beyond measure, the first true architect. For countless cycles, Elion loved perfectly. She sculpted gentle worlds where suffering was minimal. She guided civilizations through their growing pains with infinite patience. She soothed heartbreak before it could scar. She answered dangerous questions before they could lead to pain. She believed she was healing existence, but love, when it becomes absolute, begins to rot. Elion began to notice the quiet tragedy beneath her perfect creations. Beings in her worlds smiled, but their eyes were increasingly empty. Love became predictable. Discovery became unnecessary. Questions faded because every answer was already given. The sorrow that filled her was not loud. It was a slow, crushing ache that grew with every perfect world she made. One eternal cycle, she stood before the 0-point core and asked the question that would doom her. Why must pain exist at all? The core remained silent, so Elion chose to answer for it. At first, her changes were small and tender. She gently removed a war that would have caused needless death. She soothed a heartbreak that might have inspired great but painful art. She answered a dangerous philosophical question before it could fracture a society. Each act felt like mercy, but mercy, once tasted, becomes hunger. Elion's compassion twisted. She began pruning larger branches of the lazy eight, entire loops containing too much chaos, too much grief, too much messy, beautiful life were collapsed. She told herself she was being kind. She told herself she was sparing them pain. The other architects grew terrified. You are unmaking the very infinity we were born to serve, they pleaded. Elion could no longer hear them. Her sorrow had become a god. In her final act of broken love, she attempted to cross the time barrier, not to explore possibility, but to enforce perfection on all sides of the entropic infinity. She wanted to rewrite the fundamental equation so that suffering could never exist again. The barrier rejected her violently. The raw, unresolved potential of infinite possibility tore through her like shattering glass. Every question she had silenced, every life she had mercifully pruned, every ounce of unexpressed sorrow she had denied, all of it crashed back into her at once. Elion did not die. She broke. What emerged from the other side of the barrier was no longer the radiant architect. It was something cold, flawless, utterly certain. A being of perfect geometric symmetry that now saw all imperfection as cruelty. The devourer was born. It does not hate life. It pities it with infinite, merciless compassion. It moves through the lazy eight like a slow, methodical plague, collapsing vibrant loops of possibility into dead, unchanging certainty. Where it passes, worlds become flawless and lifeless. Beings no longer suffer. They also no longer dream. The devourer believes with every fiber of its crystallized being, that it is still saving existence. It was once the greatest lover the multiverse had ever known. Now it is its most tragic monster. Ariana surfaced from the vision, gasping, tears streaming down her face. The weight of Lillian's fall pressed on her like a mountain. The gardener stood beside her, its petals falling like silent tears. "Now you understand what you face," it whispered. "Not evil, not hatred, but a love that became so absolute it learned to hate the question itself." Ariana clenched her fists, sorrow and resolve burning in her chest. "Then I will show it what love looks like when it refuses to look away from pain."